Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting a Death Guard Plague Marine for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. And we're going to be painting this miniature in that really iconic classic Death Guard scheme, so that's that sort of muted green with lots of brass trim and of course loads of weathering effects. Now whilst we are going to be painting a regular Plague Marine for our example, the methods and techniques we're going to show you here can be applied to just about anything in the Death Guard army. So I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. To paint the Chaos Space Marines of the Death Guard, the best undercoat to go for this particular colour scheme is of course Death Guard Green. So this is a spray from Citadel, it's what I've gone for here, but if you don't have access to this colour, then really any sort of neutral tone like this will be absolutely fine. For example, a grey or a khaki, whatever you're comfortable with really. But what you need to do is start out by painting the miniature with a sort of olivey green of your choice. Now once again here, I'm going to go for some Death Guard Green, and you might be wondering then why paint this over the top of a spray that's the same colour. Now this is because the spray paint version of a colour and the paint on pot version of a colour is always going to be different, especially when it comes to the finish once they're dry, and you will see this difference. And whilst that might not seem important at first glance, it is important later on if you make any mistakes and you have to clean up. So it's just good practice, even if you're using that spray colour as the main part of your colour scheme, just to quickly paint the miniature entirely with the paint on version of that paint so that you don't see this difference. So that's precisely what we're going to be doing here. So I've got Death Guard Green, and to apply it, all you'll need at this stage is a rough base coating brush. So I have a medium base coat brush from Citadel here. You need to get some of this paint onto your palette and thin it down with that little bit of water to make sure it's nice and smooth. And with that prepared, it's then just a matter of painting over the miniature with this colour. Now, because these two paints here are actually very similar in tone, you can see there's not much of a difference here, but it means this first coat is going to be really quick and easy to do. If you have gone for a different undercoat colour here, you will need to just steadily build up the colour. Just be sure to make sure you get a nice even finish before you move on to the next step. Once that's done, the model doesn't really look any different, but that is an important step nonetheless, and you certainly will see the difference if you put the two kinds of paint next to each other on the miniature. But with that done, what we can now do is move on to start to pick out various details on the miniature. And the great thing about painting Death Guard is because they're all mucky and gross, a brown wash works well for just about every colour on the miniature. So what we're looking to do is apply as many base coats as possible that can share that brown wash. Now we'll start out with the metallics, and for this I'm going to go for some bronze first of all because there's quite a lot of it. I'm going to go for some Spartan bronze for this, then we can move on to any silver metal, and here I'm going to be using some Undercoat silver. But we'll start out with Spartan bronze, and for this what you'll need to do is just change brushes depending on what you're comfortable with based on the sort of size area that you're doing. So just change quite a lot from model to model. In this case I'm using a size 0 from Artis Opus, which is a good all-rounder size here, but feel free to go for a smaller or larger. If you want to go for a Citadel brush, I'd recommend a medium layer for this phase. But just make sure you thin that paint down with that little bit of water, and also be careful not to overload your brush here so that you don't lose control of the paint, because we're basically looking for any sort of decoration at this stage. So that's going to be things such as the trim on the shoulders, and you can see we've got this one just here. What you need to do is neatly move in and start blocking out that detail, just being really careful of any armour that you want to keep green. So you can see I'm just being really careful as I get to it right there. If you do happen to make any mistakes, it's not a problem, just let the bronze dry and then go back to Death Guard Green to clean it up. But for this stage, you're basically looking at all the trim, including the trim on the body and the legs too. It's much more narrow down here, but it's the same sort of thing, these parts that go around the edges of the panels. Also keep an eye out for any decorations, such as the marker Nurgle that we've got on the side of the bolter just here. Once you've found all those decorations to pick out in bronze, you're then ready to move on to base coating some silver. So here I'm using some Undercoat silver. And this is generally going to be for all the mechanical details. So various bits and pieces on the bolter like this, but also keep an eye out for any blades. In that case, we've got these spikes on top, so it's one on top of his helmet. Also, he has a plague knife around here, and be sure to keep an eye out for any chainmail on the miniature too, such as all this that we've got hanging right here. I finished base coating all those metallics now, and here you can see the various details I picked out, which when it comes to the smaller details on the miniature actually is the vast majority of it, but there are still some other areas that we need to pick out with some other colours, so we'll do that now, and then we can put that brown wash across all of them at the same time. So we're going to start out with the black features, so there's going to be things like the Vulcan casing, that sort of thing. Here I'm using some Death Reaper, which is an off black, which will get shaded down when we put that brown wash over it to give it a little bit of depth. With that done, we can then move on to base coating the fabric, and here burgundy is a really nice contrast to the colour scheme we've got so far, so I'm going to use some Sword Hilt burgundy, and then what we can do is base coat the Nurglings. Now when it comes to Nurglings, there's a million different colours you can use, but here I'm going to go for a pale green, so I'm using Ogryn Camo as the base coat here. Finally, there's a whole load of details that are bone on there that we need to get to, and so here I'm going to be using some Dragon Fang. But we're going to be starting out with some Death Reaper, and to apply this I'm going to be sticking to my size 0 brush, but again feel free to change as you need to depending on the details that you're doing. As before, we just need to make sure the paint's thinned down and ready on the palette, and then it's just a matter of looking for all the features that you want to be black. And this is mostly going to be things such as the weapon casings. So in the case of the bolter, we're looking at this feature around here. As we block this colour in, just be careful of those metallics that you've done so far as you base coat that area. But also be sure to keep an eye out for joints in the armour, and there are a few in this guy here. They're a little bit hidden away, but you can see there's some of the joint just around here in the back of the body. So we're looking for features like this that we can base coat at this stage as well. Here we have the miniature with that black applied, and also I kept an eye out whilst I was doing it for little pipes as well, such as these ones just up here. And once you're happy with all of that, it's time to look for any fabric, and here we'll need a burgundy. So I'm using some sword hilt burgundy, and on this miniature, it's really just the loincloth to do here, but just bear in mind there is a massive amount of variety between Plague Marines, so be sure to keep an eye out. Next up, we're ready to base coat the Nurglings, and these can really be just about any colour you want them to be, but in this case, I'm going for some Ogryn camo. And then finally, it's time to move on to a dark bone colour. So here I'm using some Dragon Fang, and this is going to be for all the bone details. So really what we're looking at is skulls and horns. And with that, we've now finished applying all those base coats that can share that brown wash. So it's time to paint on that brown wash. And in this case, you just need to pick out a dark one. I'm going to be using some Battle Mud wash for that reason. And to apply it, you want a really large brush that can cover a lot of ground quickly. So I'm going to be using a medium shade brush from Citadel. Now with this brush, what you need to do is just load up a generous amount there and then just start painting it all across the miniature. As you apply it, just make sure to work it into all the nooks and crannies as you go along. So for example, if I start on the leg just here, you can see what I'm doing is really poking it into all the recesses, making sure you really get all that shading in those details. Now whilst you're at it, if you see any large amounts collecting on flat panels, then just use your brush like a sponge to soak away the excess. You won't get rid of all of it, but the less that's on there, the quicker following steps are going to be. So what you're aiming for is about that sort of level of application before you move on. Now when you are putting this quantity of wash onto a miniature, it's very easy to overdo it, and if that happens it can start running and pooling in certain areas. If it dries that way, it doesn't come out looking too nice. So for example, if I get lots and put it onto the plague knife just here, areas that stand out like that are a great culprit for this sort of thing happening, because the colour tends to run down and starts collecting in a big blob there like that. So if you spot that happening, what you do is just touch your brush to it like a sponge, just soak away the excess paint, then redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature. And once you have got it all over, give it around about 45 minutes to dry. The wash is now completely dry, giving us all that shading there in the miniature, but it has dulled things down quite a bit. So now what we need to do is a little bit of layering just to clean things up. Now I know saying cleaning things up with the Death Guard miniature sounds a little bit strange, but trust me, this is important because we need the colours to be a bit brighter and a bit more bold before we do weathering over the top of them, so we get a bit more contrast and help those details stand out. So to do this, we'll return to Death Guard green first of all, so that original green that we used, and to apply it this time, I'm going to be sticking with my size 0 brush because the application here needs to be much more controlled than what we did when we originally just painted the model entirely with this colour. So on your palette, make sure the paint's thinned down as usual and under control, and you won't need loads on your brush this time, so just use tissue or the palette as necessary just to remove excess paint so that you can bring those bristles to a nice point. And with that prepared then, this time we're looking for that green armour and we need to reapply this colour over the top, looking to avoid recesses as we go. So if we look at this plate just here, for example, that means applying it onto the flat area just here, but where we got this little chip in the armour just there, it's going to carefully go around it, leaving it darker with that shadow still showing, with the wash still settled in there. I'm also being careful as I get close to the trim. You can see I'm not quite dropping into the corner right next to it, and again, this is just to retain that shading. So it's basically just a matter of doing this across all of this green armour. With that stage done, you can see the armour now is cleaner, and whilst we are going to make it a bit more grubby later on, the important thing is that the colour's standing out nicely now. So with that done, we can do the same sort of thing on 3 other areas, and we'll start out with that burgundy fabric. Obviously quite a small detail in this particular pose, but on some Plague Marines there's quite a lot of it. And for this we'll need to return to that original colour, so sword hilt burgundy is what I'm going to be using here. With that done, we should do the same sort of thing on the skin of the Nurglings, and again go back to the original colour you used, so in my case that's going to be Ogryn camo, and then for the bone we can go just a little bit lighter to create a bit of contrast with the shading that we've got on there so far. So here I'm going to be using some Skeleton Legion. But what we'll do is start out with that burgundy. So I'm going back to sword hilt burgundy here, and I'm applying it with the size 0 brush again, and with the fabric, the idea now is to look to avoid the deeper creases that we've got on it. So it's only a small bit to do, just down here in the loincloth, but you can see how we've got some folds that go into shadow. So the idea is to look for the parts that stand out, such as this bit of fabric just here. Then when you get to recessed parts, such as right in there, just skip past it and carry on again on the other side. Next up, we can return to the flesh of the Nurglings, and here we need to layer them with the colour that you originally used. So in my case, that's going to be some Green camo, and it's a matter of looking for the parts of the muscles that really stand out. And once again, just be careful to avoid any recessed detail. And then finally, it's time to move on to all the bone details, and here I'm using some Skeleton Legion, which is a little bit lighter than the base coat colour I used here, and that's just because I'm looking to really push up the contrast on these details. So when you're looking at things like skulls, it's a matter of just again being careful to avoid any recesses, and you see you get that nice strong distinction now between the lighter areas and the darker areas. And it's going to be things like the forehead, around the eyes, around the nose, teeth, that sort of thing when it comes to skulls. Now there will be horns and things too, so we've got a big horn coming out the shoulder just here, and when it comes to painting these, it's applying the paint in lines going down the length of it. So you can see I'm just following it down here like this, and the idea is just to bring the colour down to points as you get close towards the bottom. So this way I'm not going all the way down to the base there, I'm just bringing it down there like that, and what this does is gives the impression of growth of that bone. So just there like that. One final thing to do with this colour at this stage is to take a look at the Nurglings, and if they've got any horns or teeth or anything like that, now's a great time to pick those out too. And with that done, the layering phase is now complete of painting the miniature, so we can move on to highlighting it. And honestly, when it comes to highlighting, this is entirely optional, and you certainly don't have to do it. And if you decide not to, just skip ahead now to where we do all the little touches like the gross flesh, for example, because that part's really fun, the eye lenses, all that sort of thing. But if you do really want the model to pop on the battlefield, then highlighting will do that. So we're now going to go through all the colours to show you what to do. And we'll start out with the main one, which is that green armour. In this case, what you'll need now is a lighter tone than what we used, which was Death Guard green. So what I'm going to be doing here is using some Green camo once again. And to apply it now, go for your smallest brush. I'm right down to a size 00, but if you want to use something from Games Workshop, then going for a small airbrush would be absolutely fine for this. You really just want a small brush that holds a good point. And what you need to do is get the paint thinned correctly on the palette where it's flowing easily from your brush, but not so much that it's going out of control. So just be careful not to over thin it with water. We're looking for a little bit of translucency there on the palette, which you can see we're starting to get. And once you've got that there, just make sure you load up your brush fresh, so there's not tons and tons of paint on there, because if you look closely, there's not actually a great deal of paint in there, but there is enough held in the body of the brush for what we need. Because once that's set up, we can start looking now for all the edges and corners that we get on the green armour. If we look at the back of the legs, it's a great example along here. Now a lot of the armour does really stand out like this, which means you can actually approach the side of the brush and skim along those edges, and this way you can get a nice sharp highlight really quickly and really easily on places like that. When you're doing that sort of approach, just make sure to keep changing the angle to make sure that you're comfortable, which will sometimes result in turning the model in quite strange ways. For example, turning it right around to do the other side like this. As I'm right-handed, it means I've got easy access to that edge there like that. But you won't always be able to do that because sometimes the edge just doesn't stand out enough. In this case, it's time to use the tip of the brush, and what I like to do is angle the model so I'm painting the line downwards because this is a nice natural movement here of the hand. This way you can get that sharp line really easily there like that. Just using the tip of the brush just to follow that edge. So now it's just a matter of going around all the green, looking for all these edges like this, just taking your time, being as neat as possible, and be sure to pick out any rivets as you encounter them too. And these little bits of corroded armour, be sure to go around these as well. Once you've finished applying that highlight to the green, you can see all the detail stands out nicely on it. So now we're going to take it a little bit further. And honestly, this is another optional thing, which is something I'd normally reserve just for characters. Basically adding a second highlight to some precise areas to help them pop out a little bit more. You can do this on your whole arm if you want to. The choice really is yours. But to do it, what you'll need now is an even lighter shade of green. So I'm actually going to mix a colour for this. I'm going to use some Green camo again, but now I'm going to introduce a light bone colour to it. So I'm going to use some Vampire Fang to do this. And what we need to do is create that colour on the palette first of all. Now I'm going to stick to my small brush for this, so I'm using the size 00 once again. I'm just going to make sure I've got a good amount of Green camo just there. And you can see I've got some Vampire Fang here. I'm just going to bring the two of them together to mix up that lighter tone. So it's basically going to be a very slight greenish bone colour. So that's what we're aiming for just there. With that mixed up, make sure you only have a small amount on your brush. And with this, we're going to edge highlight again, but now we're looking for the parts that are more prominent and really stand out. So the face is a great example of this kind of thing where we're looking for the central part of it really. So you can see the nose just here. What I'm going to do is just introduce a small amount of this lighter colour over the top of the highlight we did before, just there, and just a little bit on these sides here. So it's basically any parts where you get this little intersection like the little T-shape there for the highlight. It just helps that pop a little bit more. Moving further around the miniature, it's going to be things like the tips of the feet. So just down here, you can see again, we've got this little intersection of highlights just here, which we can just push further with a little bit of that colour there like that. And also we can do it on parts like the hands just around here. Again, we get these highlights coming together. So just want to focus on those parts and just add a little bit of this colour to those areas. And with that, the green armour is now complete, and we'll add some effects over the top of it later on. But before we do any of that, what we need to do is finish highlighting other colours on there. And we'll do the metallics first of all, starting out with all that bronze trim. To highlight this, you'll need a pale gold colour. So I'm going to go for some glistening gold, and then for the silver, you want a bright silver. So here I'm going to use some mithril blade. But we'll start out with glistening gold, and to apply it, I'm going to be using the small brush again. So that size 00 is what I'm going for here, because just like with the green, we want to keep lots of control over the paint and look for all those edges and corners once again. So on your palette, just make sure that paint's thinned once more. So I want to bring them down to about this sort of consistency. See, nice and smooth, a little bit translucent there. Remove the excess paint, bringing the bristles to a nice point, and then we can start looking for all that trim and all those edges. Now, the great thing about these miniatures is a lot of this trim really stands out. So for a large amount of it, you can actually just use the side of the brush and just skim along there like that. And you can see it's very easy to access these parts and get those highlights. Just remember when you're doing this technique to make sure you turn the model so that you're comfortable in the application, because this will help out with the accuracy, which again does sometimes mean turning it at quite strange angles, but you see by doing this, it's nice and easy to get to these areas. Now that we've got all that brass highlighted, we can do the same thing on the silver details. So here I've got some mithril blade, and to apply this, go for the exact same technique on all these silver parts. So for example, on the magazine down here, just using the side of the brush to skim along, but also bear in mind that when you're doing the silver, there'll probably be some chainmail to highlight too. When it comes to chainmail, a good thing to do is just remove excess paint, and I'll often just do that on the back of my thumb there like that, because this way you can just lightly brush downwards on the links and it just picks out that raised detail really easily. Once you finish that stage, all the metallic details will be highlighted, and I always like going through that phase of painting Plague Marines because now all those details pop out so nicely. But we do have a few more highlights that we've got yet to apply, and for this we'll need 4 paints. We'll start out by highlighting the skin of the Nurglings, and here all you'll need is a lighter shade than what you used in the colours so far on their skin. So in our case, Creed Khaki will be really good for that. With that done, we can then highlight all the black features in the miniature, and here I'm going for some rodent grey, so a slightly sort of earthy grey here, so really leaning into the kind of corrupted feel of the Death Guard. With that done, we can then highlight the burgundy fabric with a pink. Here I'm going to use some glistening gums, and then finally it's time to finish off the bone. Here you'll want a light bone colour, so I'm going to use some Vampire Fang. What we'll do is start out by highlighting the skin of the Nurglings. So here I'm going to be using Creed Khaki, and I'm using the size 00 brush once again. Just need a small amount of this really nice bright green here, because with it we're just looking to pick out all the raised features that appear on their skin. So with the paint thinned and ready, we can start looking for them. And if we take a look at this little Nurgling that we got down here, looking for any features that really stand out. So it's going to be things such as the curve of the muscle on the arm just around there, little fingers going down here, then we've got his chest just here, we can go around the pectorals. So it's all these parts that really stand out. Just follow along with a little bit of this colour. The next thing to do is highlight any black features on the miniature, and here I'm going to be using some rodent grey. So this is a slightly brownish grey, which will lean nicely into the character of the Death Guard, and with it we're looking for the edges and these black details. So on the bolter casing you can see I'm just using the side of the brush again, but also we do have the joints and ridges in the armour. Now these can be a little bit tricky to get to, such as the one that's hidden just around there, but to get these all you need to do is just touch the brush a little bit to them just to bring out some of that texture. So just very lightly skim along, just to pick out some areas there like that. And here we have that black detail highlighted, so it's time to move on to the burgundy fabric, and here we need a pink. So I'm going to use some glistening gums, and we're looking for the peaks of the fabric like this crease just here, and with the tip of the brush just pick that area out. And then finally we can finish off the bone details, and here you'll need a light bone colour. So I'm using some Vampire Fang, and when it comes to things like horns and teeth, apply this in the same way that we did with the layer earlier on, again following those lines down towards the bottom there like that. But when it comes to skulls, in this case we need to pick out those parts that really stand out. So that means going around things like the eye sockets just there, picking out the teeth just down here, and just these little ridges that we've got going up to the forehead, and just a fine highlight across the forehead as well. And with that, we've now finished painting the vast majority of the miniature, so it's time to have fun by picking out some of the gross Nurgly details. And what we'll do is start out by looking for any sort of flesh bits. So here's going to be tentacles, tubes, that sort of thing. What we need here is to start out with a pale skin colour, so I'm going to use some elven skin. With that done, it's then time to pick out all the pus inside the pustules, and here you want a deep yellow, so in this case, I'm going for some darks and yellow. But first of all, we need to look for all the flesh parts, so I'm going to use some elven skin, and to apply it I'm actually going to stick to my small brush, because on this miniature these parts do tend to be quite small, but there's a massive amount of variety from the different Plague Marines here, so just change as you need to. For all of them though, make sure your paint's thinned down and ready as usual, and then it's time to start looking for them and blocking them in. And it's going to be things like little tentacles, and we've got one just emerging out the belly down here, so you can see this one just here. Just want to neatly block this in at this stage, but also keep an eye out for tubes and things too. There are some on the side of his leg just here, so I'm going to pick these these out at this stage as well. Once you've found all those flesh details, we're then ready to pick out all the pustules, and here you need a dark yellow. So I'm using some darks and yellow, and on this model they all appear on the Nurglings, basically just these little bumps such as these around here. Now that we've got those details picked out, we can do the really fun bit, which is to put some contrast paint over the top to really stain them with some colour. And to do this, we're going to be using 3 paints at the same time. What I've got is some Guilliman Flesh, also some Magos Purple, and some Contrast Medium. Now, Contrast Medium's the outlier amongst all of them because this one basically doesn't have any colour to it. But what it's going to allow us to do is dilute the other two without changing their properties and allow them to mix and get some really interesting tones as well. So what we need to do is get this set up on the palette first of all. Now, I'm using my size 0 brush for this, and I'll start out with some of the medium, which is obviously clear, so it's a bit tricky to see it here, but what you want is just a good little puddle of it there on your palette to draw from. The reason why we're using the palette here is so that whilst we're using the colour, we don't go into the medium, because if you do this, what you can do is contaminate it with some colour, so it is important to keep it separate. But now we can put the colours next to it on the palette, so we'll grab some Magos Purple, so there we go, good little puddle there of that, and we can do the exact same thing with Guilliman Flesh, so a little puddle just there like that. So the plan is to put all 3 on at the same time, and do this, what I'll do is start out with some of the medium just here. I'm just going to load some of this up and apply it to some of these fleshy parts just to get things going. So if we take a look at these little tubes we've got down here, I'm just going to apply a small amount on there like that, and then whilst it's still wet, I'm just going to grab one of the colours. So this is Magos Purple, just going to put it on there and allow it to mix into that medium and just push it around there like that, and you can see what we get is some nice tones on there that give the impression of almost bruising going on. Now, once you've applied a certain amount, just switch over to the other colour. You don't even need to wash your brush for this. This is Guilliman Flesh, just going to apply this as well. And again, just poke it around and allow it to mix with the paints that we've got on there. And this way you get a really nice effect of those colours just merging together there like that. So now it's just a matter of doing this on all the fleshy parts, but also we can do it over the pustules too. And in this case, I'm going to start out with Guilliman Flesh. Again, just to apply a little bit over the top of them there like that, just to get some shading, and then whilst it's still wet, just jump to one of the other colours. In this case, I'm actually going to go for the medium, so you can get some of that and just apply it over the top and just use it just to poke around again so that the colour fades out onto that surrounding flesh. And here we have the result of the contrast paint now dry. You can see it gives those really nice gross colours and all those flesh parts there and the pustules as well. And so with that done, we can now highlight these features. And what we'll do is start out by highlighting all the flesh. Here we need a very pale flesh colour, so I'm going to use some Flayed 1 Flesh. Now once that's done, it's then time to highlight the pustules. And here we want a pale bone colour, so I'm going back to some Vampire Fang for this. But we'll start out with Flayed 1 Flesh, and to apply this one I've gone down to my size 00 brush again, and all we need to do is look for any ridges or any parts that stand out on these details and basically just follow along those areas with this colour. You won't need very much of it, and it's a good idea to thin it down just to make sure it's a little bit translucent. So you want to bring it down to about this point just here, and then it's time to start looking for these features. And if we go to these tubes that we've got on the side of the leg just down here, you can see we've got all various little bumps and ridges and stuff like that. What we want to do is go around the outside of these ridges, so areas such as just there to highlight that feature, and whenever there's any bumps or any parts that catch the light, just be sure to go along those as well. And once you're happy with that, it's then time to highlight the pustules. So here you'll need a pale bone colour. So I'm using Vampire Fang, which I thinned down just like with the Flayed 1 Flesh. And with this, it's just a matter of painting towards the top middle of each of these pustules, just to give the impression of that little white head. And there we have it. With that, all those pustules are complete, as is all that gross flesh. And so now we can move on to the next of these smaller details, and this is going to be the eye lenses. Now, like a lot of details on Death Guard, there's all kinds of shapes and sizes here, but all of them can still work by following the same general method, which is to start with a deeper red and work our way towards yellow. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is start out with a base coat of Asmodeus red, and then move on to some Demon red, so nice bright red here. Then we can use some orange flare to really take it further, and then we'll finish off with a bright yellow. Here I'm going to use some yellow flame. But we're going to start out with Asmodeus red, and to apply this one, you definitely want to go for the smallest brush you have. So in this case, I'm using my size 00 once again. What you need to do is just get some of this thinned and ready on your palette, just really making sure you have that good point on your brush. And then when you're ready to apply it to the miniature, just really brace your hands to be as steady as possible and gently move in and start applying the colour along the length of the eye lens like this. Now you can see we've got a bit of shading in there from earlier on, and what we want to do is take advantage of that, allowing that darker colour still to show in the recesses either side of that lens, so just there like that. Then it's just a matter of bringing it round onto the other one as well. When you're happy with that, it's then time to move on to a bright red. So here I'm using some Demon red, and this time with this particular lens, we're looking to focus it on each side of the eyes. So it's going to be a matter of painting a line now a little bit further in, so we're leaving that dark red showing around the outside. Then I'm just going to skip across the middle and leave it dark right in the center and do the same thing on the other side there to give the impression of it being two eyes there like that. Now, in addition, if you want to, you can also use this colour to pick out the eyes on the Nurglings. And of course, they are very, very small, but if you decide to do so, just make sure you've got that good point on your brush, keep your hands as steady as possible, and just carefully go in just to dot them with this colour. Next, you'll need a bright orange, so here I'm going for some orange flare. And on the eye lenses, it's basically the same sort of process, only making the line a little bit more narrow this time. So just focusing it towards the centre of the eye, just a bit tighter there like that. Now, if you also decide to paint the eyes of the Nurglings, you can use this on them too, and in this case it's an even smaller dot just in the middle of each one. And then finally it's time to move on to a bright yellow. So in this case I'm using some yellow flame, and again it's the same sort of thing on these eye lenses, but just an even more focused line this time just in the very middle of each area that we've been highlighting. And there we go, those eyes are complete, and at this stage the Plague Marine is very nearly finished. And to be perfectly honest, you could just do the base now and the model's going to look amazing on the tabletop. But when it comes to Death Guard, a really cool thing to do is some weathering, so we're going to do that now by just adding a few effects just to get more of that corroded feel. And to do this, we'll start out with some verdigris and some rust. Now I'll start with the verdigris, and here I'm going for two colours. I'm going to begin with some Cursed Blue, followed up by some Ray Gun Glow. And then for the rust, I'm going to use some Dry Rust Brown. But we'll start out with those blues for the verdigris, so I'm going to be starting out with Cursed Blue. And this is a turquoise colour that we've got here. You can see I've just got a little puddle of it there on the palette. And I'm using my size 00 brush to do this because we just want to thin this right down with water, and we're just going to add very small amounts of this into recesses on various bits of bronze detail. So what you need to do is really add lots of water to make it very runny there like that. Very, very inky. Just load up a small amount on your brush and then start looking for areas on the brass where you'd get moisture collecting. So for example, on these studs that we've got here on the shoulder plate, what we can do is go for these parts, and it's just a matter of just dotting this colour into those recessed areas there like that, and just letting it just flow into those corners, and here you can see then we get that nice effect of verdigris. Once you're happy with that, it's then time to move on to a bright turquoise. So here I'm using some Ray Gun Glow, which I thinned down the exact same way as the previous colour, and what I'm going to do is just dot it into some of the areas where we've done that verdigris already, but just smaller quantities this time, just to give a little flash of a brighter colour just deeper in these areas. Now that we've finished doing that effect, we can add some rust, and we can apply this in the exact same way. The colour I'm using is Dry Rust Brown, which again I've thinned right down with water, and using the small brush, what I'm going to do is start introducing this into recessed parts on the armour. So you can see these little pitted bits that we've got. Just going to run it into areas like that, just to get that nice rusty appearance in those parts. You can also add it onto chainmail too, and onto flat metal as well. So on the chain links we've got here, so we can just start running it into some of these recesses to give that nice rusty appearance. The same thing on the flat side, the blade works really nicely as well. And now we've got those effects applied, you're at a stage where you could base your miniature, and at this point it'll look great on the tabletop. But if you want to, you can now experiment with something really fun, and that is to add some enamel paints to the miniatures, which if you've never done before, I definitely recommend you give a go, because it's great for weathering effects. So for Nurgle, it's absolutely fantastic. Now the advantage of an enamel paint over an acrylic paint is that it takes quite a long time to completely dry, and this means during that window you can actually reactivate it with some thinners, and by doing this you can get some really interesting sort of almost faded effects on the miniature that look really realistic. So doing things like rust becomes really simple and really easy, and the great thing about a model like this is that you don't need many enamel paints to try it out as well. So as I say, if you've not tried it before, give it a go, it's definitely worth having a try with it. Now what you'll need to do is pick out a good sort of rusty paint for the effect we're going to be doing here. So I've got one from AK Interactive. This is Rust Streaks, great colour for this sort of thing, and the plan is to apply this onto the miniature and then let it dry, then reactivate it with some thinners. Now when it comes to the thinners, a tip I have here is to actually get hold of two and try and make them from different manufacturers as well. See, I've got two just here. I've got some from Humbrol and I've got some White Spirit, which do the same sort of thing from AK Interactive. Now the reason why I've got two is because I use one to wash my brushes. So you can see this one here, it's all murky inside there. This is great for the brush that you use in this phase here. Just wash your brush in that, it'll be nice and clean. However, that can also have an effect on the miniature itself, so I like to keep the clean one because this is the one we can actually paint onto the miniature itself, and this way it's not going to do anything that we don't want to happen to the colour. So that's why it's a good idea to have both, and the reason why I recommend you get them from different manufacturers is because this way it's very hard to get them mixed up by accident. But what we need to do is start out by applying that enamel paint. So we've just got to get some of this ready. To apply it, I find it's a good idea to have a selection of brushes that you keep just for your enamel paints. And I've got one such brush just here. This is a small layer brush from Citadel. And with this, what I'm going to do is just get some of this paint onto the palette. So just like you're doing with an acrylic paint, really, just get some of it on there. Don't need to thin it down or anything like that, but it's a good idea to have a little puddle on the palette to draw from, because this way you can gauge exactly how much is on your brush. So what we need to do is load up some of this, just making sure you get a fairly good point there on the brush, and then start having a think about the miniature as to where you get rust collecting on it. So if we take a look at this leg just here with the armour on there, what we can do is start running it into some of the recesses around here, just dotting it in there like that. We can also add a few streaks going down as well, so just kind of run them down there like that. You can imagine like water dripping down there and just leaving a trail, just things like that coming from various little pitted bits on the armour there like that, and then just allow it to dry. When you're happy with that, it's time to move on to some of the thinners. So here I'm using the Clean White Spirit from AK Interactive, and with this, just got a small amount here on the brush. What you do is just start painting it very close by to the enamel paint, and what will happen is it'll fade into it and reactivate it. So you see it starts to go a little bit fuzzy, and by then playing around with it, it starts moving again, and this way you can just start easing it into the surroundings and start to get those really nice realistic looking streaky effects there on the armour. And really it's just a matter of playing around with it until you're happy, just gradually working away at it, just building up those effects there like that. Now with this done, it's then time to base your miniature, and as ever, it's entirely your choice what basing scheme you go for, but in this case, I'm going to be going for an urban rubble base. And with that base now fully painted, this Death Guard Plague Marine is complete and ready to spread disease and decay across the Imperium. So when it comes to painting this particular colour scheme of the Death Guard, the number one thing that I really recommend you do is get hold of an undercoat of Death Guard Green. Now this is because the paint on version of Death Guard Green is actually quite a weak paint, and if you're going over a different undercoat colour, it can take quite a bit of time to really build it up. But if the miniature has already sprayed that colour, that initial step becomes a real quick one to do. Now after that, the trickiest part about painting them is just neatly base coating all of that trim. But once that's done, painting the rest of them is a breeze, and it gets really fun towards the end, especially when you're doing all the gross details. So have fun painting your Plague Marines, and we'll see you again very soon.